Hey, everybody, Off the Mic Sports Network here. Another edition of Off the Top Rope. So, a big story. Um, a lawsuit was filed in Michigan, Wayne County, I believe, um, involving Chris Dispenza, who is a former an independent contractor production employee that did some work with AEW, dating back to an incident involving Jon Moxley in 2023 during his steel cage match with Kenny Omega. That was the famed night where Don Callis turned heel on Kenny Omega, which is kind of ironic considering here we are 2 years later, and Don Callis and Kenny Omega are still feuding with each other, even though now it's Okada who's involved with this, and now they're heading into one of the bigger matches in professional wrestling, at least in the North American side of things, in a long time. Um, but this lawsuit was kind of eye-opening. And I know that a lot of AEW people, specifically, like, a lot of, AEW schmucks and, geeks and fanboys and sickos are trying to brush this off like it's nothing. Um, and a lot of people are going to look to me and say, Mike, you're one of the biggest critics of AEW in the community. And I was like, yeah, I'm critical of AEW because I think they could be running their operation a lot better. And there's a lot of messy things that go on in this company that can be protected. And this is the latest example of that because, first of all, the fact that this wasn't handled ahead of time is a problem. Um, this shouldn't have gotten public. You've got a multi-billion-dollar owner who should be overseeing the company, and like if stuff happens, usually settlements come out of this, and I had imagined that this would probably get settled, but the fact that this became public is an issue. And then the problem that I have, and I understand that shit happens in wrestling, but for fans and people alike to just brush this off like it's nothing, and that the fall or the push that because basically what happened was Jon Moxley was supposed to be handed a screwdriver in this match 2 years ago, and as a result after the handoff, he shoved this guy Christopher Dispenza, who had done a bunch of independent contract work through AEW for a bunch of wrestling shows throughout his, and so he was shoved to the ground, and apparently suffered some neck and some other spinal injury. He suffered some extensive injuries that were disclosed in this lawsuit, and people are brushing this off like, oh man, that's nothing. It's not that big of a deal. First of all, this guy is not a trained wrestler. That's the biggest problem here is, and I heard multiple people within the industry and, people who have commented on this issue. It is known in the community, at least in the wrestling sphere, that if you're doing a spot like this and production people are involved, real life production people, they're not trained to take bumps. This is not what they're supposed to do. So, and people who are in wrestling, at least if you've seen people train or if you've watched biographies or whatever, it takes years for people to properly take the bumps the correct way without getting hurt. So this guy was forcibly shoved to the ground like it was nothing by Jon Moxley in a forcible way, whether it was meant to be real or however this was. This guy was not prepared to take a bump like that. And regardless of how you feel about this guy's lawsuit or whatever, that is a fundamental fact that production crews are not trained in the sports entertainment art. And there is like, as much as we like to talk about, I don't like using the word fake. It's predetermined, and like there's elements of that are sport, and there are elements of this that are entertainment. But at the end of the day, these guys are performers and they are athletes. And there is a certain art form to, taking bumps and, executing moves to a certain way. This was not planned. And we don't know why this took so long to reach it. Like, I think I was reading something as a part of this lawsuit that because he had to go do another job, I don't know why he was still working for another year beyond this. But if you're one of these sickos who's trying to go to bat for your company and basically trying to make them look like they're right in this situation, AEW does not look good in this situation. No matter when this happened, this cannot happen in virtually any company. It is commonplace to know when you are trying to execute a spot, that makes somebody look like a production tech, or like, if, there's supposed to be a bump and, there's supposed to be a protection, even if you have people posing as fans. Like I remember just seeing an old clip recently of Brie Bella and Stephanie McMahon about 10 years ago, where Brie Bella slapped Stephanie McMahon. Stephanie McMahon then slapped Brie back. And you want to know who was in the background to, to break the fall of Brie Bella? Aaron Solo. Aaron Solo, the guy who used to be engaged to Bayley, who is now a jobber performer in AEW. You usually, in these type of situations, for stuff like that is planned to, like, to be executed, or like, to make sure that things run smoothly. If you want to have a spot like that, then you have like some sort of wrestler. I remember, you guys remember back to WrestleMania about 15 or so years ago, when Undertaker, like, tried to, do a tope over the top onto Shawn Michaels in their first WrestleMania match. You remember Sim Snuka was involved in that, Jimmy Snuka's son? Like, he was the cameraman there. Like, production people, or like, camera people, usually when you have these type of spots and you try to execute them, it's usually a trained performer. So yeah, I don't know what this guy's end game is to get a quick buck, why he didn't file this sooner, but there's no two ways about that. This is a bad look. This is a really bad look for AEW. One, that it got out and they didn't, they could have easily settled this, and it didn't have to be made public. But then the other part of this is, like, you watch that thing back, there's no defending that situation. In any form of entertainment, any form of professional wrestling, you cannot put your hands on the production people unless they agree to a spot like that and understand, hey, you are taking a risk and you are putting yourself in harm's way. If he was not briefed on that whatsoever, and based off of this lawsuit, he was not, that is completely on AEW. That is completely on Jon Moxley, who should know a lot better. He's been doing this a really long time. That you cannot do that, no matter what you're trying to do or how much of a loose cannon you are. Matches are meticulously planned out, and they are put in certain ways to make sure that they go off without a hitch. Accidents don't happen. And when it's on this high of a level in a main event match, granted it was 2 years ago, you just can't have stuff like this happening in your company. Like, botches happen in wrestling matches all the time with wrestlers. But when the talent is putting their hands on the people that are working hard on that show and are putting their bodies on the line and sacrificing many late nights to make sure that the ring looks okay, that the ringside area is cleaned up, that everything looks okay, like, you can't have your wrestlers putting their hands on, people and risking things like that. It's not okay. And I don't care who, listen, I'll be the first to tell you some of the stuff that's happened in WWE. It's reckless, but that stuff gets handled. But you don't see professional wrestlers putting their hands on actual fans or putting their hands on actual production talent. Like, you don't see that. You just don't. So look, I hope that this guy is okay. I don't know what his end game was, but and then Ricochet's made himself a complete asshole lately. He quote retweeted this story from John Alba of Sports Illustrated and basically said, "Man, y'all are a bunch of pussies," and then he had to delete it because he knew he was wrong, and somebody within AEW had to tell him, "Dude, this is a serious situation. Shut your fucking mouth." Like, I don't think people understand what a serious situation this is. No matter how you feel about this production person or, what leg he has to stand on, the bottom line is, in any form of professional wrestling that has been known to man, the wrestlers are trained to take bumps. Taking bumps is not as simple as just falling to the ground. There is an art to do it correctly. And when you're literally forcibly shoving a guy to the ground who was literally told to give you a screwdriver, and you shove him to the ground just to make it look more violent and whatever, and then we just move on to the next piece of the match, when he doesn't know or expect what's going on, that's not okay. Now, whatever comes about of this, who knows? But it's not a good look for AEW whatsoever. It's not. Like you cannot have this type of stuff continually happening. And there's been botches, there's been, bad production cuts and whatever. But this is not something that, like, if you're one of these AEW sickos and fans who's just going to want to dunk on this guy, listen, I don't know what his end game or what he's going to ultimately decide to do, or he's probably going to settle and get some money out of this. And I don't know why it took this long. Legal proceedings do take a while to handle, but there's no way justifying what Jon Moxley did. And at some point, hopefully it will get rectified and cleaned up, because listen, you can't have stuff like this going on in your company. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that situation. I know I'm going to probably get hammered for it, but it's just, listen, it's little things like this that just cannot happen in your wrestling company. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.